one more module left that needs a bit of attention, and that is the frequency shifter. A frequency shifter is a bit an odd module, in a sense that it's not a module that you would commonly find in a synthesizer. Actually, for a very long time, there was only one frequency shifter available, which was the Bode design frequency shifter produced by Bob Moog in the 60s, probably built 20 or so, and that was it. Nobody wanted it, because for standard music, it is a bit a strange thing, because basically a frequency shifter is sort of like a luxury ring modulator. The technique comes from the radio world, because so the idea of a frequency shifter is already like from the 20s of the past century or something. Because if you look at what happens if you want to do a radio broadcast. If you do a radio broadcast, you can transmit in the middle wave band with AM amplitude modulation. You can also broadcast in the VHF band with FM modulation, and then in between those bands are the so-called shortwave bands. And if you have an old radio and you tune to that shortwave band, sometimes you hear these strange sort of ring modulator kind of sounds and things that sound like somebody is talking, but it's totally impossible to figure out what the guy is saying. And together with the Mexican dogs and all that stuff, quite interesting sort of stuff that I used to listen to when I was like 15 years old, and oh, wow, sounds from space. So, but basically if you do radio transmission, there is a very practical problem, and that is a problem of how much money do you want to spend on buying and using the energy that you're sending into the air. Because basically if you send energy into the air, you would like all that energy to be information. But if you, for instance, take amplitude modulation, with amplitude modulation you have a sine wave signal that is modulated in amplitude, but it is not fully modulated. It is only modulated between like maybe 30 and 70%. Because the radio also needs a bit of that carrier frequency, basically the frequency that you use to modulate, to be able to get the information out of the signal. That means that in total you only use 40% of the power for your information, and whatever else you broadcast is just energy for which you have to pay at your electric company, so you're burning money that way. With frequency modulation, it's already a bit more efficient, because with frequency modulation, you basically always radiate the same amount of energy, because the amplitude of the frequency modulated signal is constant. It's only that it changes in frequency. But still, you have to radiate a lot of energy into the ether, and yeah, you have to pay your electricity company for the electricity you use for that, and that costs a lot of money. Like if you have a 75,000 watt radio station, that's a lot of money that you pay to the gas electricity company. So they have thought of systems where basically you only broadcast, you only send to the ether what is really essential to broadcast and nothing else. The system that is used for that is called single sideband modulation. And single sideband modulation just simply means that if you do amplitude modulation, AM, you basically have a center frequency, that is your carrier. Now you fluctuate that carrier signal in amplitude, but if you fluctuate a wave with another wave, you also produce frequencies that are different than this frequency. And so you start to produce frequencies that are sort of close to this one, but within a limited band. Because if you limit your bandwidth to 5 kilohertz and you broadcast at 1 megahertz, then you will only have products that are 5 kilohertz up or down in that signal. So basically, that means that this is basically your bandwidth. But the information of what you send is actually only in this. So they call this the sidebands. This is the upper sideband, USB, and this is the lower sideband, LSB. And if you could only broadcast one sideband, that would be great, because you don't have to broadcast this, you don't have to broadcast that, but you will broadcast all the information you send. So they came up with a technique how to produce this sideband. Then at the receiver side, you have a bit of problem, because to be able to retrieve this information, your radio actually has to regenerate this one basic carrier pitch. And if that one is a little bit off, then the sound also starts to sound a little bit odd. And if it's more off, it sounds to sound more odd. So basically, the technique that is used here, we actually is more or less the same as that is used in a frequency shifter. So basically what we do with a frequency shifter is we create two sidebands, and separately. With the radio you would only broadcast one of the two sidebands and specify to the receiver whether you would broadcast the lower or the upper. But actually the frequency shifter has two outputs, and the upper sideband is on one and the lower sideband is on the other. Now, if you do ring modulation, you will actually produce exactly the same. Only the upper and the lower sideband will be together on one output and are not separated. So the difference between a frequency shifter and a ring modulator is only that a frequency shifter has two outputs and the bands separate on the two outputs, and the ring modulator has one output and both the upper and the lower sideband on the same output. But it's actually quite fun to split them, and I will sort of demonstrate to you. As an input, we take a very simple sine wave signal, sine wave signal, sine wave signal, sine wave signal, no modulation at all, just plain sine wave signal. I put it in the shifter input, and now we can listen to the lower sideband. Actually, this is more or less the original pitch. But now I start to turn this knob. And even kijken, I need to close this one, I need to close this one. And suddenly the pitch goes down. Now I connect it to the upper sideband, and suddenly here it goes up. And if I do this in stereo, we have perfect left, right. No, okay, we have a thing in the room. No, okay. So now you can hear that we have sort of detuned these. But with a sine wave, we get pure sine waves as a result. Actually, you can hear that I purposely built in a little bit of distortion into the frequency shifter because I wanted to give it a bit this sort of vintage kind of sound of the 50s and the 60s. So not to become too clean. But now if I start to add other partials, you hear that these partials are actually enharmonic. But you can create nice and lush stereo effects with, if you just take a very slow frequency. But the fun starts if you actually use feedback. If you start to feedback one of the outputs into the input to build up the sound. Because this frequency shifter also uses all-pass filter networks. That means that the sounds that come out have quite a long phase delay compared to the input. And that means that you can do tricks. So if I now start to give it a bit of feedback. And you hear that you have a sort of like a filter resonant effect, but that effect always comes from above and goes down, above and goes down, above and goes down. Which is a little bit like these so-called barber poles that barber shops have outside, where you have this sort of circle that makes it appear like it's always going down or going up. Actually, it goes down because I take the feedback from the lower sideband output. I can actually also crossfade the feedback to the upper sideband output, and then it reverses. We get an endless shift up. And if you just give a bit of modulation, just a bit of PWM to the oscillator. You hear that we can create sounds that are very similar to phasing. And you can hear it's also in stereo. It gives a nice stereo feel. But that is also a bit the thing about it, the catch, because this stereo effect is not mono-compatible. So if you have a sound in stereo and you have this this nice stereo effect, if you now basically pan the stereo effect to mono, you hear that you get this silence beating. Now if you pan it back to stereo, you hear that that is gone. So that means that if you use both outputs of the frequency shifter, you're not mono-compatible. And you have to take that in mind, because maybe you make a recording and somebody else is playing it on an old mono cassette deck, radio, whatever, and suddenly he hears something completely different. And the reason is because you hear constant sound in the stereo, but the phase relationships between the left and right is sometimes they are in phase and sometimes in anti-phase. So in mono you get these cancellations.